There's something out there. Great. Well, thanks to everyone who's braved the rain and whatever transport chaos to join us this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here to what is our William Smith Lecture here at Burlington House. So I'm Alicia Newton and Director of Science and Communications here. And coming in through the door is this evening's speaker, Dr. Rod Graham, who is our 2022 William Smith Medallist. We awarded the medal for excellence in applied and economic geology, and we were very pleased to deliver your medal to you as part of our President's Day event in June. And today we're delighted to have you here to tell us about some of the many advances you've made over your career that led us to offer you this award. So specifically tonight, I'm told you'll be discussing salt tectonics in Provence, the evolution of ideas over a lifetime. So the subalpine mountain chains of Haute Provence and others are intricately linked with massive intrusions of salt. And over the course of your career, you've developed many intriguing insights into just how the salt fits into the broader tectonic story. So Rod became a lecturer at University College Swansea in 1971 and switched his research interest to the structural evolution of the external alpine chains of Provence. And in 1984, he joined BP as a structural geologist. And after BP, he moved to Monument as chief geologist, then LASMO as a global advisor, and then finally Emerald as an exploration manager. After retirement, he became an independent consultant and visiting professor at Imperial College, as well as becoming closely involved with ion geophysical in the interpretation of deep seismic sets on the world's continental margins. So just following Rod's lecture, there'll be a 15-minute question and answer session. I'd ask you to please raise your hand and wait until we can bring you a microphone. Just that helps with the recording, because otherwise your question might not be picked up when we put this onto YouTube later. After the conclusion, we will also be offering the lecture on YouTube, so you can tune back in if there's anything you missed. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Rod to the stage. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you. Well, it might have been for applied geology, but there's not very much applied today. What I'm going to talk about, really, there has been, I have been able to apply at various times some of the things that I'm going to talk about. But it's essentially pure and mostly field-based geology. And I'm really going to trace the exposure throughout my time, my life, in my association with this part of the world. I mean, there have been other parts of the world, of course, as well. But this one has always been pretty special from way back in the 70s, when, in fact, there's somebody in this audience who was an undergraduate student at Swansea and did his thesis there in 19... Right. So, okay, that's it. And this picture, the top picture, shows what is very famous. If you were a French student, you would know it. It's a very funny, you can see that it's a syncline, but it's a very funny syncline. It's a syncline that goes round in like half an egg. And it's called the velodrome because the similarity with a velodrome. And we'll come back to it because it represents, I think, in a way, the essence of what we've tried to do over the last few years, which has been to reinvestigate some of the things that were mysteries before. And what I also want to do is just say, I've been quite fortunate after spending most of my life in industry. I was at Swansea, and then most of my life was in industry. When I retired, I did join Imperial College, and we've had two research students who've looked at a lot of this again, And a lot of their conclusions and their stuff is built into this. And one of them, Sam Brooke-Barnett, is sitting over there just now. So, and the point I want to make, and I want to conclude on really, is how when you get new eyes looking at things, how your perception changes from something that really I've known sort of every stone by its Christian name and surname, but I didn't get it right. So we'll go back through time from some of the naive stuff I did a long time ago, and we'll see, try and bring it up to date. And that's another, just a list of the people who, we've had a team of people. It's been an association with the University of Po and with Jean-Claude Ringham back from Total, and Sam named Cellini and Adam Cicek have been the students involved in doing the PhDs. And that cartoon up there shows the kinds of things that idealized salt geometries, if you want. And we will come back to that slide, and we'll come back to some of those other things, because some of those things you can actually see very well in this area. That is the area. Let me say, first of all, how I became interested in it, because I did my PhD on the Lewisian in northwest Scotland on hard rocks. And the lady whose picture is on that on the wall over there was my supervisor, Janet Watson. And when I left, and that was at Imperial, obviously, Janet. When I left there, I was so sick of the rain. I really thought I need to go and work. If I'm going to work in the field, I need to work somewhere which has a better climate, where you can actually be sure that you can work. And there was a chap who was appointed same time as me in Swansea, who was a metamorphic specialist. And so we decided he'd worked in the Alps, did his thesis in the Alps. We decided we'd go and relook at the Alps, maybe in the light of plate tectonics at that time. Unfortunately, we chose a part of the Alps which was the narrowest bit of the range. And if you know about structural geology, you know that the narrower that things are, usually the more strained they are, and therefore the more difficult they are to understand. And one year at Swansea, after I'd not been there very long, the professor there is Derek Ager, who's a famous stratigrapher, a peculiar man, but a pretty good guy. And he had some undergraduates in a place called Castellan, which is out in the, I've got a laser pointer, haven't I? Which is just about here, in these external zones of the Alps, because that's the Alps, that's a close-up of the little bit that we're concerned with. The red stuff is crystalline basement, and blue is Jurassic, green is Cretaceous, and the yellow stuff there is tertiary, which of course belongs in the foreland basin, ultimately, of the alpine compression. The rocks are mostly carbonates, and they were deposited. I mean, there's, if we just take from goodness, I've forgotten his name for a minute. See you a moment. It'll come to me. The Shell Atlas of Paleogeography of Europe. This is how it was in the Trias. It's important because the area of Provence where we are is in the Germanic bit of the Trias. That's to say, the Bunter, the Muschelkalk, and the Kuiper, which is essentially terrestrial. Orange on there is a continental deposit. And then, of course, this then becomes the site of the Ligurian Ocean, a narrow ocean that opened. There was rifting in the lower Jurassic, and then the ocean opened in the middle to late Jurassic, and we are inboard of that ocean. So the stratigraphy is here. That's the Trias, and it's got evaporites in it. And those evaporites, which you can still see in places, nowadays it's nearly all gypsum, but there was obviously quite a lot of salt there. I mean, salt doesn't last through geological time because it dissolved, but there was a considerable amount of evaporites, and these external ranges of the Alps are detaching on that evaporite. In other words, it slides down southwestwards from the more internal part of the Alps. And those colors will come again and again, and we can think of the crystalline basement, the Trias and Lias, and then a post-drift section up from the Middle Jurassic within the Cretaceous, and it's nearly all limestones, as I say. The rocks, that's gypsum. That's the kind of stuff that lubricates these nap sheets, and when it's in contact with the carbonates, there's a de-dolomitization process goes on, and the evaporites react with the dolomite, and you get this peculiar rubble rock called carniole, which is everywhere in Mediterranean Europe, Tethyan Europe. When it's not all messed up by tectonics, which it easily becomes, you can actually go from the Permian section through the basal Triassic sandstone up into the Muschelkalk and eventually the Kuiper. And there are two levels of evaporites, and that's how it is when it's not particularly deformed. And if you want to see the whole section, then you can in various places. You can see all the way up the stratigraphic column, all the way from the Triassic to the Oligocene in one outcrop. And you might notice in here that the word Lias applies to this thin little bit of rock, which is vertical here. And then the next unit, this is the Dogger, the Middle Jurassic, and then the Oxfordian shales are in here. And the Tithonian limestone, which is a recognizable thing everywhere in the Alps, sits up there. So you might realize that there's something very funny going on in here, and a great thickening of the section. Now, for the moment, I'm just showing you that slide because it's the whole stratigraphy, but those thickness variations are something that I'm going to come back to. My interest was always in the basement, and so I thought, well, if I'm going to work in the Alps, and the bit on the internal side of that massif is a bit too hard there, I'll look at the basement cover relationships on the west side of the massif. And so this is the kind of area, and I will come back to that because this is an area that Sam over there has been working on for his PhD, one of the things. And it's lovely because it has repetitions of that Tithonian limestone. And also, if you look down there, you can see this nice limestone gets ripped up into bits. And normally, it's not like that at all. I think I maybe skipped one. Normally, it's like that. It's a good, solid thing in the landscape, which you can see for miles, and it doesn't change thickness. However, in some places, it does quite dramatically. And you can see that it is faulted, but the faults are ductile. They sort of string out all these lozenges of the limestone. So I diddled around in here. I wrote a couple of papers, one of which was ridiculous. Somebody once said it was geomysticism at a meeting, and was probably right. But the idea is that this is the deformed basement, and over the top are these nap structures. And it's actually famous ground because it's in the area of the River Tine, and it was a place that was made classical by Paul Fallow many years ago, because the thrust comes up and then it disappears. Now, what happens to it? Fallow didn't particularly care, but anybody who tries to balance a section would want to know where that displacement went. And I having looked at the whole thing, had the opinion that the displacement went up and under in a black shale formation, which was in the middle Cretaceous. And so the displacement was translated out into the foreland. So these were these original diagrams, and you can compare them with the things when I finish that Sam and others have been able to achieve now. And that those bits that are strung out on the picture are actually there. But there are a series of repetitions here of the stratigraphy, genuine, big thrust structures. And it's fallows, tenae, naps, and the displacement has to go somewhere. I came to the conclusion that they were probably gravitational. And it was a silly conclusion, really, because we know that the age is wrong. The elevation of the massif, the crystalline massif behind them, took place in the Miocene, whereas the structures themselves are obviously older than that. And it's something, again, that I want to come back to. But there are two alternatives, obviously. They could have been there beforehand and then elevated, or they could have been formed by gravitational gliding. Nobody ever believed the gravitational gliding hypothesis, and I can understand why they didn't. But when one's eyes get open to different things, or the new work that's been done there, you'll see that it might not be all that stupid. Anyway, there we are. Let me just point out the main features here. This is Provence again. This is a great big thrust plane. This black line is a thrust system which is known as the Dean thrust. And nobody quite knows where it disappears to up there. Perhaps perhaps one of the members of the audience does, but I don't. And then underneath it is another thrust sheet, which is a subsidiary thrust sheet. This one formed in the Oligocene, this one formed in the Miocene, and then going on in the Pliocene, and it actually runs out along a land surface, which is really almost present day. And the other thing that's important on there is that yellow line there, which is the edge of a late Jurassic carbonate platform, which affects really a lot of the geology that I'm going to be talking about later on. So that's a picture of the Dean thrust. It brings basinal rocks over the foreland, and this is a bit of Oligocene trapped inside a syncline in older folds, and it's a huge thrust structure that you can trace for a long, long way. And I've spent half my life drawing sections in this area. Was one of the very early ones I did, and those two, which are the red sections on there through different bits. And then much later, I drew sections that actually went through the area that I've just been talking about and showing that picture of, where through that bit of the Dean thrust. The reason that we did it, and that's a restored version of it, which of course restores a basin back and has the basin thrust onto the carbonate platform. Other people have drawn sections. That's one that was Mary Ford and Henry Licorice drew after my first one, but before the second ones. And that's a more modern one, which has been drawn by one of our students, Adam Chichek, which is the best of them all, I think. And that's the line of it. Now, we used to use this as teaching. I've worked for, you didn't mention Hess when in my bits and pieces of oil companies. I did work for Hess for a long time. First of all in BP, and then later in Hess, and then later when I was independent, we used to use these. We used to get people to actually draw these sections in the field, long sections, 30 or 40 kilometers long, because at that time, when we were exploring in fold and thrust belts, that was what people needed to do, and they needed to restore them. And so we used to run these classes where everybody drew sections and then had to predict the well in which the sections intersected. You couldn't do that kind of thing nowadays because HSE would stop you, because we used to have little teams of 3 or 4 people in individual cars, and that simply wouldn't be allowed. But then we used to discuss what everybody had done, and then say, well, where would you put the well? What's in that well? And was it in the right place? And so on. So that's the applied bit. It's about the only applied bit that you'll hear on this. But it was great fun. Those are those sections again. They are rather complicated, but look what happens. This big Dean thrust structure with its basinal rocks on top comes right over the top of everything. And it's this area that we will be dealing with as we go on. That was the well. It was a genuine well, and we had a well log that Total had drilled down to the crystalline basement. And it was really interesting to see that what different people came up with, and very sobering to realize that, you know, I mean, the things that people did was remarkable. Let's put it that way. So those were the sections we asked people to draw. That's the applied bit. On those section lines, there are some really weird things. This isn't on the section line, but it's, if you look at the section below, which is an old French survey section, you see this weird thing that looks like a, what would you call it? I mean, when you put it onto the landscape, that's what it looks like. It's a mushroom. Now, how on earth can you get that by thrusting? The answer is, of course, you can't really. There are other weird things. There is a peculiar formation, which they call the Poudre d'Argent, which is Paleocene in age, and very local, enormously thick, but you don't see it in more than 3 or 4 localities. What on earth is that all about? I mean, that's only a small bit of the thickness of it. And I tried very hard to understand these things in terms of thrust tectonics, because that's what we all did at the time. I mean, I'm talking about the sort of 1980s or late 70s. And a lot of this stuff was just plain daft, actually. But I mean, it's right on the surface, but it's just impossible to put together again. And the one thing that's missing in all this is an understanding of salt, and I didn't have any, because salt tectonics changes all sorts of things and generates structures which are not possible to produce in other ways. And the 2 guys who, I mean, my knowledge of the Alps owes an enormous amount to them. This gentleman, Pierre-Charles de Grazianski, was professor at the École de Mines after Marcel Lemoine, but he kicked off the understanding of salt in Provence, as well as the understanding of the evolution of the passive margin of the Alps. I mean, they were wonderful. This guy was just wonderful. And they were years ahead of the time, but there was still an awful lot that needed doing, particularly because the advances in understanding geometries created by salt tectonics took an enormous leap forward because of exploration, mostly in the Gulf of Mexico, because you can actually see the seismic. It really is quite remarkable. And you see these weird sort of structures. That's on a TGS calendar, that this thing goes right around here and comes out there in a great big sort of lollipop. And you can see beautifully these localized areas of sediment in between blobs, diapirs of salt. So I was working on the Gulf of Mexico. I was working in Hesse. I had an awful lot to do with all of that. At the same time as the seismic was being done, some very talented people, academics in the US, were working in Mexico and very carefully mapped the margins of a salt diapir, El Papelote, and they described what they called halokinetic sequences, unconformities and weird geometries adjacent to the salt diapirs. Mark Rowan and Kate Giles were the people who were preeminent in this, and it was pretty brilliant. And then, of course, we got these wonderful images of the seafloor of the Gulf of Mexico. The Sigsbee Escarpment is a great big splurge of salt, which comes out to the topographic surface, that is the seabed, and goes across it for a long way. So we haven't got anything quite like that in the Alps. But this is the conclusion of a talk that I gave a long time ago. And it was that if you're looking at a mountain chain, and you see things that you just can't get your head around, that don't add up, and that you can't draw a reasonable, balanceable cross-section through, then probably there's salt involved. So that's what we're going to see now. In one of these courses initially with BP, I was with a chap called David Roberts, who you may or may not know, and he'd had some salt experience, and together we looked at this really peculiar structure which you can stand on the roadside or just up the hill and see. And I'm sorry, and you see all this is Triassic in here, and you see the Middle Jurassic and the Lias come over and flop over, and this top of the mountain there is inverted. And we struggled with it. And I remember Dave saying to me, do you think it's got anything to do with salt? I said, I don't know. I've never seen anything like that to do with salt. Well, we hadn't then. Well, we have now. But so with a group from Hesse, we looked at this, and I realized what it was. And we got the then salt expert in the world, Martin Jackson, to come and sort of check it out for us and verify it. It's there. You see it on the flap, and that's what it is, comes over like that, and all of that is inverted. Now, in fold and thrust belts like this one, external fold and thrust belts, that simply doesn't happen. And the other thing is, it's big, and that's it on the geological map. And that's it back again on Google Earth, and the dimensions are there. It's also completely undeformed. The stylolites are still as stylolites, and the fabric of the rock isn't deformed, though those are fossils in it in a hard ground. The section is extremely reduced. So how do you put all these things together? It's underneath the Dean thrust, which has been eroded away. It's in the sky. But all the structures in it don't have anything to do with the Dean thrust. They would have the opposite asymmetry. So we thought, well, this actually it tells you that there was originally salt above this thing, and that it formed in this kind of way, where there was originally a salt diapir, which actually breaks out onto the topographic surface. That topographic surface was the seabed in the Oxfordian time. And the reason that this section is thin is because it was growing on top of the diapir, and it was thin. The sediment wasn't added to it. So it looks a bit like that. And Martin Jackson had made models of this kind of thing. And you can see here where the sedimentary section is overturned underneath this thing, which is actually a salt weld. So the salt has been coloured in on that section. That's from Mark Rowan. So there it is again. What we're looking at then theoretically is something that was under there. Salt will break out when the relationship between the rate of sedimentation and the rate of salt extrusion, when they don't kind of balance each other. If they balance each other, the salt just kind of keeps growing to try and get to surface. But if the sedimentation is very slight, then the salt will break out onto surface. And that's been one of the major discoveries that the new work of the group and the 3 students that I mentioned have done and documented very well. Now, so what I'm going to do now is just run through some of these structures, and there they are. They're all the way around the arc, this arc of Castellan, with the movement towards from the basin towards thrusting the basinal rocks over the carbonate platform. Where they tend to be concentrated is actually in the marginal area of the platform. And I don't think that's accidental. They're also along this strike-slip zone, which was the subject of Sam's PhD thesis, because north and west of there, they are dominantly basinal rocks in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. And south of there, they are they belong to the carbonate platform. So there we are. That's a diagram from Sam's thesis. Both, I think, probably both those are, and that's the basinal rocks. That's the strike-slip zone. And I think you might see, if you remember, where I showed you that early work that I did on Fallowstine in Alps was actually here, adjacent to the Argentra Massif, and that really this strike-slip zone connects them all. Let's look at some of these things. What we're going to be looking at are, first of all, things that are called mini basins in between what were salt diapirs. Now, that structure, you can see it's a syncline. It's got the youngest Liassic rocks. It's almost entirely Liassic, Lower Jurassic in age. And it's surrounded by salt, a few complications here. And it goes round, you see it goes round in a circle. Well, that's a weird thing. And I could never understand it. Just trying to understand it in terms of thrust tectonics was completely impossible. That's it, again, on Google Earth. It actually sits on top of this Dean thrust I've been talking about. But it's this area in here. La Robine is a lovely little village in the middle of it. Now, name Cellini, the student who worked with us but from the University of Po, looked at the stratigraphy and mapped it all very carefully, and the thickness increase in that syncline is enormous. And he came to the conclusion that the thing is a mini basin. So we go back to the simplified diagram of all the things that salt can do, and this is a mini basin. Now it's formed of Liassic, so it's the oldest rocks, and it just sort of kept on growing. It sits to the south of the flap structure that we were looking at a while ago. And it's been translated on the Dean thrust. So originally this thing was way back, and it's been brought forward along with the thrust, but it is nevertheless a mini basin. Now there are others. There are other of these things. There's a related structure a little bit further north. There's still a lot of residual salt in the area of the northern part of the area that we've been dealing with. And you can still see this huge mass of gypsum, which forms a mountain. And underneath it, there is another one of these overturned flaps. So it's pretty certain that there was salt tectonics going on. there are other, the blobs refer to the places where these things are, but near Castellan, where I started looking at Provence, you can see the same sort of thing. You can see a basin, which is kind of circular in map view, the Taulan Basin, and it's an extraordinarily thick section with extraordinarily thin stratigraphy on either side. And that diappears with complex structures, including one which is an upright isoclinal fold, because it was originally a diapir and the salt has been squashed out of it. There's some more nice pictures of those things. This is the Taillon mountain that I showed earlier, with this mushroom shape. And this is another view of it in the context of the basin going up to the platform, and there is the extrusion and the mushroom of Taillon. So they're really extraordinary, these things. I'll try and they broke out onto surface, as I say. I said earlier on, salt breaks out to surface when the sedimentation rate is low. That means that it's the time of black shale deposition. And in Provence, that means it's in either the Oxfordian Colovian, the Upper Jurassic, or the Albo-Aptian, which is both of which are major black shale formations. And the more we've looked at this, the more we realize that there was enormous breakout over the whole region. Now, you don't see the salt particularly anymore because you only see bits of it, because of course it's been squashed out, it moves, salt is very ductile, so it's either squashed out of the way or it is dissolved out of the way. And what we briefly have a look at this thing called the Barème Basin, which is another classic place in French geology, where people talk about a piggyback basin, because it is a piggyback basin. It's carried on thrusts, and it's a bit of foreland, carried on thrust sheets, but it does all kinds of peculiar things. And this was looked at. It's that place where I drew these completely unmanageable, unbalanceable sections. And it's that place where you get this huge localized formation. Now, careful mapping that Adam Cicek did shows something really quite remarkable. It shows these limited synclines with squashed diapir remnants between, and then a basin which goes all the way from the Upper Cretaceous all the way through the Tertiary, which is partially rotated. And the way that we envisage that evolving is, if you go back into the Cretaceous, that there was massive breakout in the Albo-Cenomanian, Aptian to Cenomanian, and then later in the Cretaceous, these mini basins developed on there, but there's secondary mini basins that are developing on top of a lochthonous salt that's come out on the seabed. And those things grow and develop through time. And then, of course, the alpine tectonics comes along and the whole thing gets squashed and turned on its head. But the reason for these structures that are impossible to draw as simply a thrust section and impossible to balance is because they are these things. They are local mini basins which developed on top of an lochthonous salt sheet. And that salt sheet was big. You can see the dimensions of it, 7 kilometers, 25 kilometers. And that is where Adam has deduced that the original extent of that allochthonous sheet was. And it would have looked like this, but on the Albo-Cenomanian seafloor, not on the present day seafloor like the Sigsbee and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I briefly want to skip up this strike slip zone, which is Sam's PhD area, just to point out that some nice things happen there. You can actually see, parallel to the stratigraphy, a band of gypsum, actually within the stratigraphy and parallel to bedding. And that indirectly links with a diapir. So that's one of the few places where you can actually prove that this thing must have gone out onto the Albo-Cenomanian seabed. And that's Sam's evolution of the system. What happened to the salt? There's a little bit of residual salt there, but most of the salt actually found its way into that strike slip zone and got squeezed out and has ended up present day in the diapir at Naluis. The extent of the canopy that was originally there, or Sam's postulation of the extent of it is that. I just want to show you something else that is quite remarkable. It's down at the south end of that fault zone, and the stratigraphy, the foreland basin stratigraphy in the whole of this part of the Alps starts with a limestone and a transgression, and then deepens, and the transgression is called the nummulitic transgression, and there's a limestone which is diachrons across the foreland. And above that, as the basin deepened because of the loading from the Alps, you get a formation known as the Globigerina Marls. The Globigerina Marls is normally maybe 20, 30 meters thick. On this section, it's vastly more than that, 200 or 300 meters. And the dip is back. You can't see it on that long distance slide, but for a long way, it's dipping down. There was no extensional faulting at the time that this formation was laid down. It's in the time of compression in the Alps. So you can't explain that growth in any way in terms of extensional tectonics. But what you can explain it by is by analogy with these systems, which again come from the Gulf of Mexico. This is one of Mark Rowan's diagrams, which he calls a row hole, where the salt hole gets squeezed out and the sediments that are laid down on top then start to collapse and downlap onto the weld, which the salt represents. And that's Sam's evolutionary scheme for this particular thing. Of course, the salt level on which this developed here is itself an holoclonous level. So that was out in the Albo-Aptian, and then this row hole system, as these things are called, developed. Where did the salt go? Well, it went into the strike slip zone and it's carried off north. Now, I did mention that that I would come back to the velodrome early on. This, of all the mini basins and all the salt structures, is really the most spectacular. When you look at it, you can get to a lovely viewpoint, look down on it, and you see that it's like sort of half an egg. It's completely closed, and it's analogous to these really rather spectacular mini basins in Turkey, in the Sivas Basin, and the analogy is pretty good. And all the way around this thing, it's overturned. I mean, you simply can't get that by by conventional salt tectonics. There are the unconformities on the side. They look very much like the halokinetic sequences that Kate Giles and others described. That these hooks that come to unconformities look very much like these. So there ain't really very much doubt about it. And the other thing about it being completely closed is quite remarkable. There it is on an old geological map, but it's entirely closed. And there's a very funny thing along it where this syncline plunges down in the direction. I mean, the syncline closes in its direction of plunge, which is nuts, of course. And the only way that you can get anything like that is to have salt that was there that collapsed. Well, the velodrome, this is my attempt from years ago, which has been superseded. I'll show you how. The velodrome kind of formed like this. We've seen this is the situation at the end of the rifting event. This is the flap that we described earlier. And then the Dean thrust, well, the Oton thrust, the lower thrust sheet comes along, carves through that and translates it. And then the Dean thrust comes along and translates the whole of that, including the mini basin that was here in between two diapirs that becomes the Robine. There are better diagrams of that. That's a little bit better, where that's the Robine basin, which has been translated but lived originally between these diapirs and then got shunted off. And that was my attempt at describing how the velodrome happened. But you'll see what I didn't consider at the time. I had all of these things forming at the edge of a diapier that kept on growing. And I thought, well, this is now up to the Pliocene. So there must be a weld in here, and there probably is. But that the salt must have formed a huge glacier, which was out at surface at that time. Now, this has been vastly improved on by Naim Salini. And this is his long section through the velodrome. This is the analogy. And that's the situation on that long section. So there's Robine, the old Liassic mini basin. And this is the Oligomycene mini basin of the velodrome, which is, as I say, analogous to that. That's the collapse, the peculiar collapse where the syncline closes in its direction of plunge, of course, comes about because you once had salt there, the salt got squeezed out, and both sides of the structure collapse. So the analogy is with things like the Salt Range of Pakistan, which is a huge wodge of salt that comes out, enormous, onto the land surface. And that must have happened at the velodrome, in the Oligocene and then in the Miocene, and you can see the development of the velodrome here. And then the Dean thrust, carrying its old mini basin, gets shunted over the top. What I want to do now very briefly, because it's about, my time is probably just about up, in fact it is up. Remember I said that the strike slip zone in here links these Tene naps of Professor Fallow with the thrust structures of the front. And these are better pictures than mine of that area that I showed you at the very beginning, with the Tithonian limestone ripped up into bits and collapsing down. And that is part of a huge listric normal fault. The fault, which is this thing called the Cruce, deforms those nap structures. And in its hanging wall, there is the latest Cretaceous and Eocene section. So we can date that fault. And it means, since it cuts those thrust structures, that the Teine naps of Professor Fallow aren't alpine structures at all, but must be related to something older. And Sam noticed that the unconformity at the base of the middle, this is the lower Cretaceous, and this is the middle Cretaceous. The thing that I assumed must be a roof thrust carrying the displacement isn't that at all. It's an unconformity. So these are old structures, and this is Sam's evolution of the region with the salt evacuating, and these structures being, after all, gravitational collapse structures, glides, even though they're big ones, from salt, which is withdrawing out of the way. And he made a reconstruction of the various naps of Fallow's Teine naps, and the stratigraphy in them is a bit different between each one. And he explains that by the original shape of the big salt body that was there in the first instance. This all requires an absolutely massive amount of salt. And everybody says, or the non-believers in this say, where is it? Well, the answer is it's gone. And it's gone because salt goes, it's ductile and it disappears. Interestingly, offshore Morocco, there was Triassic salt offshore. That salt has moved as an allochthonous sheet and lands offshore. And there's a huge amount of salt here, but it's Triassic salt. When you go back to where it came from, there is pitifully little. So the amount of salt that is, the fact that there isn't very much salt left now doesn't really bother me at all, because the structures tell you that it was there and it did all sorts of awful things to thrust tectonics. So that's my lot, I think. The conclusions are there. It's hard to see these things sometimes because the alpine compression and the alpine thrust structures do disguise them. Some of the salt structures were known before, some weren't known, but the really new thing, the dramatic thing that the new work that the students have done shows is the presence of these very large canopies, and that's absolutely new. And then these two motherhoods here, I started off without the faintest clue about any of this, but I've always struggled with this part of the world, used it in different ways, interpreted it in different ways, and I think we're actually somewhere near the answer now, but it took younger pairs of eyes to get there. That is it. Sorry to have gone on.
We still have a few time for a few questions if anyone would like to jump in. I mean, if anyone's shy, I could start, but.
Thanks for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. I had the pleasure of doing this area in my undergraduate mapping, and I can assure you the bars to Shin is quite hard to get up. So good effort for going up there. One thing I struggled with when I was first looking at the area was that obviously there was this big overturned section, and what I could see is the Terre Noire, that lovely shale that was, there was no internal structure that we could really see, but we couldn't really see the salt. And as our ideas developed, we then thought that that was obviously coming into play and the Terre Noire was less important. But do you think that the Terre Noire had an effect on the deformation in the area at all? I mean, obviously depending on timing, but especially with the emplacement of the naps at a later date.
I think only one of those, like if let me just whiz through all these, just back to one of those simplified diagrams. Hang on, I won't be long. Bear up there. It's that's the Bardachine. Behind it, there is a huge mass of Trias. You know, you go north between there and where the autochthonous comes up, that beautiful sandstone. That's all that happened. I think. I mean, this thing is developing, and essentially, the Oxfordians laid down a mini basin, and you know, there's a hiatus in the deformation, and the salt crawled out across it. I agree with you, it's very hard to get to, but you see the equivalent of it in the vertical section down by the road. So everybody, I mean, everybody looks at that as the reduced section. And I think the first time I went there, I was trying to persuade people that it was a reduced section on top of a tilted fault block. And then, you know, the thrust must have cut through the tilted fault block. But it's just so easy to explain in terms of a growing diapir in the Liassic. And but you know, I think Steve very well knows a gentleman who simply doesn't believe it. And he's an alpine geologist who's worked there for years, but I just don't see any alternative, to be honest. But you mapped the Bardachine.
Yeah, they're interesting, and the structures, the cloches, the grand cloche and the petit cloche, they're quite impressive as well.
Yeah.
Sort of their own decompts. I think they were possibly using the Tournois with that sort of those smaller structures, but. No, it's very interesting.
Very good.
Yeah,
Where did you do that from?
that was with All Holloway when I was there in 2017.
Oh yeah,
So, yeah. But thanks.
it's a great place.
Quick question. First of all, thank you for a great talk. It was really enjoyable. Most of the structures that you've described are sitting within a relatively complex Oligocene and younger fold thrust system, right? If we go just a little way to the west, to the northwest, so Sisteron, eastern Barony up to Trièvre, back across the Durance Valley, there are quite extensive outcrop zones of Terre and in certain areas mid Cretaceous. Is there it's an area that has well described Triassic gypsum diapirs all across it.
Yeah.
In that region, do you see any evidence for breakout and canopies?
No, not to my knowledge.
Why do you think that is? Given that there's quite a thick sedimentary section there, and a significant carbonate progradational system coming in the Bohemian and Aptian across the basin margin from the west.
I'm not sure. Higher sedimentation rate, maybe. Once you cross the Durance fault, I think that you go to the area that they call the Barony.
Yep. And
the synclines are very broad and the anticlines are very squashed. So I think that there is rudimentary, that the salt is, and there is, of course, a beautiful diapir at Bouillet Barony where the stratigraphy is very condensed around it. I've not been there since I went there with Grazianski, so it's a long while ago. Let me just, so the last time that you see any of the really weird stuff, that line there is, Steve, is the Durance fault, which is a bit on echelon, but it goes up eventually until it gets to your house.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing here is the end of this big foreland basin. This is the Valensole Basin. But the plunge of that syncline is vertical to overturned. So the end of the Valensole Basin is, there is a bit of gypsum there, but you know, so there's pretty stunning stuff going on there, but not any more than just squashed anticlines and maybe an upthrust when you go across the Durance Fault. And it may be sedimentation rate. I mean, it may be sedimentation rate in the Oligocene and the Alboaptian, because the shale sections are generally thicker.
I mean, it's an impossible question to answer, but do you think that the area that I'm talking about could originally have seen substantially thinner evaporite deposition in the late Triassic?
Yes, yes. I mean, it could. It could. And maybe it's not drawing on such a big area, you see, because this, all the salt that was up, I mean, essentially the salt's all moving away from the hinterland towards the foreland. Everything's getting squashed out on there. I mean, the latest movement, those big listric faults that we're hopefully going to see in a couple of days' time, and I'm going out with some, this huge thing, called the Cruise Fault, which is Paleogene really in age. What drove that? I mean, that collapse of the whole section, it must have been the emplacement of the Embruneubi nap sheets, the load, I think, that just makes everything spread away. But the spreading also has the salt move out. So all of that salt could have, the salt basin in a way to the more internal could have been virtually infinite. Whereas when you cross the Durance Fault, of course it isn't.
Could be more patchy.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Rod. Thank you.
One more. And
Yes, Rod, I told you I was going to ask you a question.
Yes, you
about
did.
the importance of of field work and what advice you'd give to young geologists, but I think your talk has answered it. And if you go back to your last slide, those 2 points at the end of the very last slide sort of summed it up for me. But I've calculated you must have had 56 years of single-minded field work.
Well, off and on, Jerry, you know.
I know, but
we have been doing other
with it for a long time, and you get the rewards. And you mentioned about, you know, sometimes you make mistakes early on when you're doing field work, and then this concept of fresh pairs of eyes and going into the field with new people, young people, people from different disciplines. But well, what's happened to geology in this country? I mean, it doesn't seem to be happening anymore.
No.
So what can we do about it?
Well, I don't know. A few years ago, about what, 6 or 7 years ago, I was on this ref thing. You know, this tick the box and marks out of 10 for the departments. And one of the conclusions at the end of that, which David Price encapsulated beautifully, was, you know, he sort of turned to me at the end of it and he said, what the hell has happened to structural geology and field geology? And there are a few places that sort of still carry the torch, but I mean, Royal Holloway does. Rob Butler does in Aberdeen. But you know, it's in lots of other places it's kind of distilled down, and I mean, it distresses me sometimes that in Imperial College they, you know, the actual independent mapping, which Steve Matthews there did 8 weeks of work in Provence, and all our theses from Swansea were 8 weeks. Now it's a fraction of that, and they do it in a group, you know. So it just, I don't know, the love of it, and of course there's HSE and there's all sorts of other stuff. But I mean, the way to really sort of understand what's going on is to be immersed in it. And it's sad that various things have contrived to get rid. I mean, it's so important because you know, you can always tell, as you guys know as well and better than me, sometimes the best seismic interpreters are people who actually know what rocks are like in the field, and you don't get these completely ridiculous 3D interpretations which can't be right. Sorry.